All right, let's get started. First off, we're going to start with a poll. If anyone in the audience has built a Shopify app, would you mind raising your hand? Quite a few. Are there anyone out there that has investigated building Shopify apps, maybe looked at the API documentation, played around with it at all? A few more? Cool. So my goal today is to have you leaving here very excited about Shopify apps and custom app development, regardless of whether you raised your hands or not, and have an idea about how you might be able to bring it into your own businesses, what sort of service offerings you could add, and also if you're not actually doing the app development day to day, at least having a bit more knowledge about it when you're talking to clients. For those of you who are experienced app developers, and I know that there are a few of you out there, I'm really hoping that I'll be giving you a bit of a different perspective on some stuff around Shopify apps, hopefully give you some ideas that, again, you can bring into your own businesses. Quick introduction, who am I? Why am I up here talking about Shopify apps? I run an agency called Disco. We're based in Melbourne, Australia, and we are, as far as I'm aware, the only Shopify Plus partners that are focused exclusively on app development. It's not just a service offering for us, it is our bread and butter. We have about 40-ish apps in production for clients at the moment. And while we certainly don't have everything figured out, I think we have a bit of experience, and that's kind of what I want to share with you today. Some of the things we've learnt, some of the tips and tricks and things to avoid. So in terms of the agenda for today, first I want to talk about what apps are, what I mean by custom app development. I'd like to also talk about why does that actually matter to you as a Shopify partner? Why would you even care about bringing it into your business? Assuming that I convince you, and I'm sure I will, I'm very persuasive, then I'm going to talk about the scoping process, what you can do to set yourself up for success when you're talking to clients about app projects. And then finally, if I have time at the end, I just want to talk about some of the opportunities. So where you can find clients for app development projects, but then also once you've delivered an app project or two, what can you do beyond that? Just as important as what I am going to talk about is probably what I'm not going to talk about. These are some things we won't really be covering. Won't really be talking about the technical side of things, so what programming languages we use, Ruby, what specific architecture you should be using or anything like that, how you skill yourself up and that sort of stuff. There's just way too much to cover, so we won't be talking about that. Won't be talking about App Store apps necessarily or marketing those apps. And then while I am going to be talking about the scoping and the pricing and the estimation of apps, I'm really aware that everyone has a very different sales process, so I'm going to try to avoid giving you a very prescriptive, this is what you must do. It's really just more looking at a holistic level. These are some things to think about at the different stages of sales. All of that said, I am very, very happy to talk anyone's ear off about any of these things. So if you are interested in this, then please catch me during office hours. We'll grab a beer later and we can talk apps to your heart's content. To turn to the definitional side of things, so what do I mean when I say custom application development? And I guess there's an answer in two parts. First of all, focusing on the application development part. And what I mean by that is really anything that goes beyond what Shopify does out of the box. So what you can do with it as a platform when it's a vanilla install plus custom theme development. So as many of you would know, Shopify is pretty powerful when it comes to the front end. There's a lot of flexibility. Pretty much anything you can do with regular web development, you can do with Shopify. At the end of the day, you're pushing HTML, JavaScript, and CSS down to people. So you really have a lot of flexibility, and once you bring Liquid, the templating language, into the mix, you're pulling out the data from Shopify's objects. You can really solve a lot of problems for merchants using just those tools. In fact, you can solve a lot of problems that a lot of merchants will run off to apps for, which is always a bit of a bugbear for me. I really hate seeing merchants installing 40 apps to do stuff like upsells or customer-specific pricing or product customizers, when a lot of that is really doable with some judicious use of Liquid and JavaScript and that sort of stuff. But there are limits in terms of what you can do with those tools at your disposal. So once you start talking about needing to edit the underlying data in Shopify. So if you need to be creating products, if you need to be updating their titles or descriptions or that sort of stuff, then that's something that you can't do necessarily with the theme side of things. If you need to start talking to external systems, so warehouses, ERP systems, anything to do with an API, that's something you can't do out of the box with Shopify. And then finally, if the actual concepts of something you want to build doesn't exist in Shopify, if you're going beyond products and variants and orders and customers and those sorts of things and bringing ideas of wish lists and return requests and those sorts of data concepts, then that's something that's outside of Shopify and something that you need to look into custom development for. So that's really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the software that is dealing with these things that are beyond the default. The custom part of the description, so what I would consider a custom app is it's a one-off bespoke solution built for a specific client and with that client. So it's a very close working relationship between you and the client. Brandon before spoke about building for the 1% of merchants. We're talking about building for the 0.002% of merchants. It's a one-on-one relationship with you and the client. It's very bespoke software. To give you some examples of the sort of stuff that we've done that meets this custom app development, just running you through quickly. This is a returns app that we built for a client. They'd tried some apps in the App Store, the returns apps that are there. They did 70% of what they wanted, but they had a couple of custom requirements. And for them, the ROI was there to build an app that really narrowed down on their specific needs. As you can see, it had a customer-facing side, a customer support-facing side. There's a separate warehouse interface for people when the returns actually came back in, and then it had some funky integrations with Zendesk and ShipEngine, their label generation. Another example that I'd consider custom application development that's a little bit simpler. So this is not code running on a server somewhere doing operations. This is a script that is sitting locally on a developer's machine. We ran this script once when we were migrating someone over to Shopify. They had a really funky legacy system that had customers and gift cards. We needed to write something completely bespoke to extract that data and push it across to Shopify. It wasn't really anything that was out there that managed these two systems before. I think the legacy system was probably originally built in the 70s or something like that. So that was a fun one. Another really common use case for bespoke or custom apps is just pushing order data from Shopify off somewhere else. So this is an ERP system that didn't have Shopify integration. We needed to do some custom business logic in the middle there before we pushed the data over. And then finally, this is kind of once you go down the rabbit hole sort of thing, this is a client that we've built, there's 5 up there, there's actually 6 now, custom apps for, all handling different parts of their business, all very, very specifically tailored to what they need. And trying to put something like this together, the apps are not only talking to Shopify and external systems, they're also talking to each other, they're also providing an API for a mobile app, trying to do that with off-the-shelf software, or even trying to adapt existing apps just wouldn't really have worked. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about custom apps. Now about the why. If most of you are Shopify partners, I imagine, a lot of you will already be offering store setup, theme customization. So what is the benefit for you if you start looking at the custom application development? And asking that's a pretty legitimate question because there are costs involved in making this switch. You not only need to learn a completely new skill, you also, if you're hiring staff, you need to hire in these qualified app developers who often can be more expensive than other types of developer. And then on top of that, you've got to sort of deal with the change management issue. So you need to work out, this is a new service offering, how are we going to bring this into our business? How are we going to sell it? Is it an upsell for existing clients? What's the relationship with our existing services? All that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's definitely costs, and it's definitely something you need to think about. But there are also a lot of benefits, and I think probably the biggest one that I would say is that it really gives you partner superpowers. And that's a bit hyperbolic, but I think it's true. So I spoke before about the limits that you can run into with Shopify. Having custom app development skills really sort of removes those limits. You're left with being able to do anything that software can do, and that's a pretty broad spectrum. So you really, as a partner, become a lot more valuable in terms of what you can do, and in turn, your clients benefit from that as well. Of course, you're always still going to be constrained by your time and your budget and the complexity of an app, but it really does mean that you can start changing the sorts of conversations that you're having with clients. So whereas before, if a customer comes to you or potential customer comes to you with some sort of funky idea, instead of saying, I'm not really sure if that's possible, or yeah, you should probably talk to agency X about that, you can change that conversation to, yeah, we can do that. Let's talk about the timing and the budget and what's going to be involved in getting this delivered for you. So it really opens you up to different types of clients, different types of projects, potentially more lucrative projects, and all that sort of stuff. The second reason that I would explore this sort of stuff is that it'll give you a deeper knowledge of the platform. So even if you don't actually end up developing apps day to day, you'll be able to talk with clients with a lot more authority about what's involved in app development. You'll have a better sense for what's possible with the platform, and you can become a better consultant for your clients, which is always a good value add. The last thing to consider is that app development is it's a premium service offering at the moment. The number of Shopify partners that are able to build apps and to build apps well is a lot lower than the number of partners that are offering store setup or theme development. And supply and demand operate, so app development is something that you can charge more for. As you get better at it, your margins are going to get better, and it can become quite a profitable revenue stream for your business. It's also something that you can use to upsell your existing clients on. So if you have existing relationships with people that you've been working with for a while, and you suddenly add app development to your bow, then you can dramatically increase the lifetime value of those customers. So working on the presumption that you're at least a little bit interested in app development and potentially what it could do, I thought I'd just start talking about some of the things you can do during the sales flow to help you with these app projects and set yourself up for success. So as I said, I'm not going to be giving you a prescriptive, this is how your sales process must run sort of thing, but all of you probably have some form of sales process that looks a little bit like this. You've got a qualification stage where you're talking to a client, working out, are you a good fit? Are we a good fit? A discovery phase where you're getting a bit more information about the scope of the problem, what you're actually going to be doing, and then finally a proposal stage where you're actually putting that all together, getting some numbers into it, sending it off to the client to sell it. So I'm just going to talk about some things that are specific, I think, to app development projects during these three phases. The first one, during the qualification phase, is to really focus on setting client expectations. One thing that we've found is that clients often have unrealistic expectations in terms of what the costs are for app development. I just need an app that replicates Facebook, that sort of thing. We have had almost that a couple of times. And that's fair enough. People aren't that aware of what app dev costs are, and that's not their fault, but it is really important to be very upfront about that. Not expecting you to be able to read this, but one thing that we do for this is our lead submission form, so we try and push everyone possible through this form. You'll see the actual form starts here, and everything above that is us talking about the sorts of projects we work on, the sorts of clients we work with, the way we work, and then we also have in bold the clients we work with have a minimum budget of $10,000 and up. Now, your number for your app dev projects, it might be higher, it might be lower. You might not throw it in the face of the client like we do. We definitely get people dropping off this form all the time, but that's fine. But I think it is important to have a number in your head, and at least during the qualification phase, make sure that you're lining up with the clients and there's not going to be a huge mismatch of expectations, which will lead to tears later down the track. The second thing during the qualification stage that I think is quite important is checking that the client understands how Shopify apps work. So clients in general that we've seen have a decent understanding of how Shopify works. They understand it's a hosted e-commerce platform, there are themes on it, it all sits there, that's all fine. But when it comes to Shopify apps, and this is even for people who are on Shopify and have been for a while, and potentially even some of us in the room, Shopify apps sit generally on their own server. They communicate with Shopify via an API. There are limits to what that API can do and how fast it can do it. And of course, you need to maintain the apps on a server and that sort of thing. And for clients, especially ones that are coming from, say, WordPress or Magento, where everything is in a giant god-awful blob, then they're not really used to that concept. So making sure that you tell them about this up front is really useful, and it does two things. First of all, you're educating the client. You seem like you know what you're talking about, and clients generally appreciate that. But the second thing is it also sets up expectations for the rest of the project. When you start talking about, well, there are hosting costs involved, there's maintenance involved, there are potentially going to be these API limits that we need to talk about. That's something that they've been forewarned of, and they're not, again, not shocked. The discovery stage of a process, of your sales process, obviously the more time that you're spending in this phase, the less risk you run of getting something wrong or not understanding the scope of the problem. So it's always good to be spending time here, but there are a couple of challenges around the discovery process when it comes to apps. First one is that it can be really time intensive. So even for a relatively simple app, would be expecting to spend a couple of hours 2 times with a client on discovery calls, at least a few hours researching external APIs or systems that would be integrating with. We'll be spending time developing UI wireframes and mockups, and then writing out a list of specifications that we can take to the client and they can sign off on. Another thing that you're doing with apps a lot of the time is dealing with third parties. So you not only need to think about the fact that you need to go and read their API documentation, you also need to get your head around their concepts, their language, how their data maps to Shopify's, what the differences are, trying to understand how that's going to work. And then there's the stuff that you can't learn from just documentation, things like is there a support person or a contact person that the client has at this external vendor? Are they responsive? Are the docs even actually accurate? 90% of the time, there's always going to be a quirk that isn't documented, and that'll trip you up. So that can be a bit of a thing that trips you up later on in the project. Another thing is that app dev projects do lead to assumptions being made a little easier than say, a theme development project. So when a client can see a mock-up in front of them, they can tell you what they don't like about it. They can ask, oh, how does this add to cart flow work? But once you start talking about apps, you very quickly get into these abstract concepts, and that gets a little bit harder to get in front of a client and make sure that you're both on the same page. So it's very easy when you start talking about data models and transitions between statuses and things like that to start making assumptions about how the system's going to work, and that just leads to, again, at the end of the project, oh, I thought you were going to do that, I thought you were going to do that sort of thing. Lastly, if you're in a situation where you're developing a custom app, it's probably going to be, or it's more likely to be, a novel situation. So something that you haven't encountered before and something that the client hasn't encountered before, because often if it's something that happens a lot, then there'll be an existing app or integration for it. So even problems that you think you've solved before, very often once you dig a little bit, it turns out that they're quite different. So even if it's, oh yeah, I've pushed this order data over to this system before, and you think that that's the situation, then you dig a little more, it's like, oh, well, last time we did it, we were doing that in real time. And this time around, it needs to be a scheduled thing, and it's a lot more involved, and it changes the whole way that we approach the app. So just trying to find that out as quickly as possible is always really useful. In terms of how you can do that, some of the techniques that we use when we're doing our discovery, the first one, this is probably, again, a really boring thing to be saying, but expectation setting, both internally at your own agency or with yourself about how much time you're going to be spending on discovery, blocking it out in your schedule, making sure that you're talking with the team and making sure they know when they're doing it. But also with the clients, again, setting up the expectations. We're doing discovery this week. You need to be available for this hour. We're going to be on a call. But before that, you need to spend an hour preparing this documentation so that we have something to talk about on that call and we don't waste time. So really hammering home that they need to be very active in the discovery phase. A tool that we find really useful during that phase is checklists. Not very technologically advanced. It's just a list of questions that we send over to the client for all app development projects. And this is a list that we develop and build on as we work on projects. At the end of every project, we will have a retrospective. We'll think about what would have been useful to know at the start of this project. Let's put that question back on the checklist for the next project. And so what we'll do, we'll try and fill out that checklist for every client based on our initial calls and our qualification stuff, hand it over to the client. They can check our answers and make sure that we have the right understanding of where we're at, and then they can fill it out with more detail. And that really avoids it saves a lot of time because we're not asking the same questions again or forgetting to ask questions. And it also gives them the chance to review our understanding. Another useful tool that we use here are workflow descriptions, which is just a fancy word for asking the client to write a big slab of text about how the system they currently use works. So if we're dealing with, let's say, a returns process, we'll ask them, tell us how you're doing your returns now. Give us every single step of the flow, who's responsible for doing it, what happens in this situation, what happens in this situation, give us the full description. Once they've done that, we'll then ask them to do the same thing, but for what they imagine the future will be like once our app is built. Again, what steps are getting eliminated, what steps are getting automated, what's changing. You can take those two documents and compare them, and that'll give you a really strong start for what's the difference. The difference there is the scope of your app, or at least the starting point for the scope of your app. So then moving on to the estimations and pricing, which is always a very tricky thing. And it's very tricky because humans just generally suck at estimating stuff. We are very, very bad at it. I think in order to be able to do this job effectively, you kind of just have to accept that everything you do is a guess. Sometimes you can get a little bit better at guessing, but ultimately it's a guess, and you just have to be okay with that. In terms of pricing your apps, probably the biggest determinant will be whether you're pricing on a fixed fee basis or a time-based basis. I don't know, I imagine we have a mix of people in the audience in terms of who does what. I can only speak to what we do at Disco, which is fixed fee pricing. And for app development projects, I feel that makes sense, and I feel that makes sense for two reasons. The first one being clients generally seem to be a bit more comfortable with it, with having a ceiling on their costs. Whether they've had bad experiences in the past with projects that have had massive overruns, but in general, we find that clients do like to have that cap. And then the second reason is that I really don't like being penalised for being efficient. And that's really what fixed fee pricing can do a lot of the time. If we're good at building Shopify apps, and I think we are, and we can build something in half the time that someone else can, we should be charging more than them rather than less. So fixed fee pricing really helps you tie the price of your project closer to the value that the customer is going to get from it, and it also leaves you with a lot more scope for developing your business, getting better skilled, and getting rewarded for that rather than getting penalised. The risk, obviously, of fixed fee pricing is that if you get your estimates wrong, then you're left holding the bag, which we've done many times. We'll probably do it many times in the future. The question is really how bad it is. Is it just your margins getting cut into, or have you lost money on the project? Yes, we have done that at times, but we're getting better at estimation, and I think the net benefit of the fixed fee pricing overall outweighs the downsides. So in terms of the estimation process that we use, I mentioned that we're getting better at it, and we are, and I think that really, experience is probably the best thing that you can do to improve the way that you estimate your app development projects. Experience is not really something that is easily taught. You just need to go out and do it. But as my mother said, the next best thing to experience is a spreadsheet. This is the first iteration of our spreadsheet. We use something pretty close to what this is now. But previously, our system for estimating processes was going through the discovery, me sitting down and just throwing some numbers out, and this sort of formalised this a little better, changed things a lot in the business in terms of our estimates and our accountability on those estimates. As you might be able to read it, but we just have the different roles. We'll estimate the number of hours, and then we have a bunch of formula that will calculate some standard things based on that. If it's going to take 100 hours for a developer to work on feature one, then we'll add 30% of that on top for the QA phase, 10% for the writing of the documentation, and then we come back and review those numbers at the end of the project again and see how accurate it was, or how inaccurate it was, usually is the case. And that all comes out to a number that we then have a pretty good idea of what the cost in terms of dollars is going to be for the client. The last thing I wanted to talk about really quickly on the pricing front was just around this idea of a Flexi Fund, and this is something that we've stolen from Ross Bailey at GrowthSpark, who's a US-based merchant. And this is simply adding a percentage of your base fee on top of the calculated fee that you take to the client as something that's going to be there as a fund to dip into for the inevitable scope changes and the new features or the things that just aren't thought of early on at the start of the project. For us, we use 15% at the moment, and that seems to be working well. And we've actually found this really quite easy to sell to clients, which surprised me a little bit. But I think customers do like that fixed fee approach, but they also like knowing that they don't have to make sure that everything is in the spec. And I'm sure you've all dealt with the clients that will spend weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks just making sure that everything is in the spec because they're terrified that if it isn't, then it's not going to happen later on in the project. So this sort of alleviates a lot of that problem and makes sure that you get paid for the changes, and it's a really good way of limiting scope creep, we find. If the client doesn't use the Flexi Fund during the project, they almost always do, but if they don't, then we leave it at the end as we won't refund it, but we will say you can use that towards maintenance or development beyond the next iteration of the app, which again, they will usually come back and do. So that's the estimation. You've got some numbers, you've put it into a proposal, you've sent it off to the client. What's different about selling an app development project versus a different type of project that you might be already familiar with? I think there are two really key things, and the most important by far is making sure you understand where the pain points are for the client and where the ROI is on the app that you're building. If you're working on a theme development project and doing a complete redesign, then the stuff you're going to be talking about with a client is how is your conversion rate going to be affected? Are you going to get more sales? Are more people going to be adding to cart? Are you going to get more repeat purchases? All of that sort of stuff. Stuff that merchants really understand how that's connected to the bottom line of their business. When it comes to apps, the same clients are very quick to think of that as a cost center, like, oh yeah, I need to build that app to talk to warehouse X. So what you need to do from as early a stage as possible is change that thought, change that perspective to look at what is this app doing for the business? What is it saving? How many hours a day do you spend on this manual process? How much do you pay the people that do that process? What's that going to mean over a 6-month period in terms of the cost saved? What's the cost of a human error in this process? Has that happened before? What's the risk of that happening? What would that mean for the business? Painting the doomsday scenario and tying it back to this app is going to save you from that. If your app is directly touching the marketing, the sales funnel for the customers on the store, that's even better. You can dig into that and understand how your app is going to help that. If you can go back to a client and say, well, this app is going to help you with repeat purchases, we think it could increase them by as much as 5% over the year. What's that going to mean in dollar figures? It's X. Our app is going to cost you X minus Y. As long as X minus Y is more, then you can make a really strong argument to the client about the ROI, and it becomes a lot easier to sell it. If this number is greater than this number, then either you need to look over a longer time period or you need to think about whether you should actually be building the app in the first place. The second thing when you're presenting the customer with when you're presenting the customer with a proposal is to make sure you're providing options to them. So don't just come up with one number for one type of for one solution and say, this is the one number, take it or leave it. There's two reasons that providing sort of an option A, B, and C can be really valuable. So let's say you're dealing with a price-insensitive client and you only provide them with option A, then that's the only thing that they can choose. And if they would pay you twice as much for that app, then you're just leaving that money on the table. So if you provide them with option A plus B, where B is some nice-to-haves that you uncovered during the discovery process, and A plus B plus C is everything in the world, then you give the client the opportunity to pay you more money if they would like to, which is always a good thing. The second reason that I really like providing options, and this is a bit of human psychology, I guess, is that I think in the heads of clients, it changes their decision from do I hire you or not to which one of these options do I pick. And that's probably a little bit of Matrix-esque illusion of choice stuff, but I really do feel like that does work for clients because the first conversation they're going to have, the first questions that we get back from proposals is often, oh, what's the difference between option A and B, or can we move this from option B back into option A? And as soon as you're starting to have that conversation, you know that you've probably already sold the client on the actual idea of the app, and really you're just discussing the details in terms of what the final scope is going to cover. So I think that, given the time, I'm going to just skip through the opportunities section. I'll leave that slide up there, and if you are interested in any of these things, then please come and hit me up towards or afterwards or whatever. This is mostly just talking about once you've delivered an app project or two, what you can do to capitalize on that and make sure you're reusing your code, you're making the most of the value that you've created. But I'll just wrap up now by just talking about what the next steps are. So I've spoken about what I think app dev is. I've spoken about why I think you should consider it for your own businesses. We just wrapped up talking about some of the things to think about in the sales process. But there's obviously a lot more to actually starting with app dev. There's the learning about it and all that sort of stuff. So I think the first thing I would say, start small. As a visual gag. Yeah, you don't have to jump for the giant custom app development straight away. You can look for those smaller things. An example would be having scripts development skills in your back pocket can be just a super useful value add for partners. So I'm sure you've had clients that want to launch their store next week and then suddenly come to you and like, oh crap, all of my product descriptions are in American English. I need them changed to UK English, or English, I guess you call that here. And instead of saying to them, no, you need to go and change those 5,000 products manually, you can say, no worries, I've got this covered. I can write a script in an hour that'll save you that headache. I'll bill you for that, but they'll love to pay you for it because they don't have to go and do it. It takes a huge stress off them, and you being able to deliver that directly without having to go out and find someone else to do it is just a really powerful thing. So getting involved in script development, if you're familiar, if you've got people on your team who are into JavaScript or front-end design, the transition isn't that scary, and there are plenty of tutorials on the web that teach you how to do that. I've written some of them, I know they exist. So yeah, I think look at starting small. And another thing you can do is if you are partnering with another agency that is building an app for someone else, or you have a client who wants to build an app and you're working with them to find another agency to do that work, then just ask them to be involved in that process and get a sense for how their app development process is working. Ask them if you can learn from them. I think the reason that we're all here is because Shopify as a community is very open to sharing, and I know that I would not have a problem if someone was like, I'm really interested in doing app dev. I know you're building this for the client, but would you mind if we learn a bit more about this process and how you do that? So definitely, make use of the community in that respect. The other thing is about, well, if you're in a situation and you're like, well, I want to start with app dev, but I'm not really confident enough to market myself as an app developer yet. How do I find these opportunities? And I think this is the simplest way to do it, is just go to your existing clients and ask them what sucks about your life at the moment. Look for the software solvable problems, not the relationship ones. But people who are not technical are very, very bad at understanding what's easy to do with software, or what software is good at, I guess. So I guarantee if you go and talk to your clients, you will very quickly find lots of situations where they're mangling spreadsheets for hours just to get something basic done. And there's just so many low-hanging fruit in any e-commerce business of any size. So talk to your clients, find out what they're struggling with, and start thinking about, well, is this something that could potentially be solved with a custom app? And that is me done. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope you have a great day. And yeah, please come and talk to me after the conference. Thanks.